Of recognition and appreciation to Isabel Gauthier for her contribution to academic inquiry and exchange and excellence at the Interdisciplinary Center for Neural Computation, Edmond Safra Campus, Givat Ram, Jerusalem, Israel. And we sign it, Naftali Tishby is the director of the agency, and Israel Nelken is the head of the PhD program here.
Thank you.
It's a real pleasure.
Thank you for being here. It is indeed a real honor and a real pleasure to introduce Isabel Gauthier to you. Isabel is a professor of radiology, formally. The formal title is Professor of Radiology at the Vanderbilt University in Tennessee, in Nashville. And the title that she holds is probably reflecting on the major method, or not the only method, but the major method that Professor Gauthier is using in her studies, which is neuroimaging, hemodynamic neuroimaging in particular, although there are many, many interesting and revealing studies in pure experimental procedures, as well as some studies using electrophysiology. So Isabel, in many ways, does whatever we try to do here in tandem. She does that by herself, using any kind of possible measure which is appropriate to the particular questions that she has. In terms of history, I'll be very brief, of course. In terms of history, Isabel finished her PhD with the supervision of Michael Tarr at Yale University, New Haven, Connecticut. Then she spent some time continuing working with Michael at Brown. Then she spent a year with Nancy Kanusher as a postdoc. And at the same time, she started gaining her title of neuroradiologist by working with John Gore at Yale New Haven Hospital, and actually learning in depth how to use functional MRI and how to analyze functional MRI images. If I had to think what is the major characteristic of Isabel, is that she is a nonconformist. There are very little things that she would accept as given, for good or for worse. And she became, through the years, a major source of interesting questions, questioning things that were taken for granted for many, many years, such as, is the brain having any specific centers to process faces? This is how we got together arguing in the first type of interaction that we had, but very, very quickly we argued civilized, and I think that our arguments led me, speaking for myself, to think twice and improve the way I think about my work and my findings in ways that I wouldn't do without being exposed to Isabel's work. Tomorrow, actually, you will hear another type of argument, which again we disagree in some ways, but I think that this makes it even more interesting, because to hear lectures that you agree with everything which is going to be said a priori, it's not interesting. So what makes it interesting is the fact that there are things that bring in information which you either have not been exposed from that direction, or you disagree with, and you are willing to be convinced by data and by arguments. So, among other things, as an outcome of the attitude towards word perception and considering, towards face perception, and considering face perception in humans as a special case of expertise, Isabel became interested in how perceptual expertise is expressed in the brain in general. And I will not give her talk, so I will stop here. And mention only that Isabel, given circumstances, arrived this morning at 3:30 a.m. in Ben Gurion Airport, And from 11 o'clock until 15 minutes ago, learned everything that could be learned about Jerusalem in a Benton's organized tour. So this is really a pleasure to hear Isabel under these circumstances.
Thank you. Can you hear me in the back? Okay. Thank you. Shlomo forgot to say that I also completely lost my voice 2 days ago to my first laryngitis ever. So the fact that I'm here, that I'm in front of you, that I have a voice to speak to you feels like a miracle. I am truly exactly. I am truly honored to be invited for this prestigious lecture, to be invited here in this wonderful institute. I haven't had a chance to meet many of you yet, but I hope I do. I certainly have a lot to learn from people here whose work I either know about, and some of you I don't know about, and I hope to get to talk to you. I have a wonderful history of disagreeing with people, and some of them, like Shlomo, have influenced my work in wonderful ways, and I enjoy that. I think I agree with you that this is something we need to do in science. We need to not only be interdisciplinary, but we need to force ourselves to work with people and collaborate with people who disagree and challenge our ideas. So with that said, I'll try to introduce you to some of my work, and I welcome your questions at any time. Because I realize not all of you are familiar with this kind of work. So feel free to interrupt for any clarification questions, and if I feel a deep debate coming on, I'll try to delay that. So yeah. So I should start by thanking many of the people who've done the work with me. Shlomo only said one thing that I disagree with, which is that I do anything by myself. I don't. I am not a very technique-driven person in the sense that I believe in important questions, and I believe that techniques, should converge, and that comes from working with people who are experts in many different methods. And so I've worked with a lot of people in my short career. Some of these people here are my students from my lab. Some of them are collaborators and advisors. Some of the work that I've taught today has mainly been done by Jen Richler and Rankin McGugan, but everybody helps with everything, and it becomes hard to know where the ideas come from. So it's important to put their names there. So I'm generally interested in perceptual expertise. Now I will define perceptual expertise briefly here as domain-specific improvements in performance. So what I mean by that is when you learn to read X-rays, let's say, this doesn't help you read music. And when you learn to recognize the gears and cogs in a watch, it doesn't help you to recognize bones in the field. Those are specific domains in which we can recognize expert performance. So I believe we're all experts in many different domains as a function of our work and our hobbies. So experts are not rare. In my view, expertise is something that's very common and very important. Now, expertise tends to be very automatic, and that's kind of where my title comes from. Experts generally cannot tell you how they really do what they do, and often when they tell you how, they're wrong, and so those insights are not typically very helpful to the psychologists and cognitive neuroscientists. So the knowledge is not very verbalizable, appears to be quite automatic. Now, so you could be interested in perceptual expertise for different reasons. And one would be, you might be interested in expertise as an outcome. So you may want to study experts because you want to train them better, because you want to be able to recognize who's an expert. You might want to know what goes wrong when someone loses expertise or fails to acquire expertise. But today I will speak of my interest. I should drink regularly here. You remind me if they drink all the time. I don't want to lose my voice now. Yeah, sure. Today, I will speak of my interest in perceptual expertise a bit with a different twist, which is expertise as an explanation, a potential explanation for something that's ubiquitous in the brain, that we see in the brain, and that is category-specific specialization. Oh, thank you. Okay, you do that. Okay, so as I'm sure many of you know, one of the characteristics of the visual system in particular, but it's true of a lot of other parts of the brain, is category selectivity. So this is, one summary slide from a review that shows specialization on the flattened part of the ventral cortex, and you can see spots of specialization. So this would come from a survey of several Fmri studies, and you see areas that are more activated for things like motion, body parts, animals, objects, spaces, and so different domains activate different regions of the map. And here's a slightly more recent example showing you a bit of the same thing. Although one thing to note here is that according to several people now, the way to think about this is that there are some regions that are specialized for some domains, like you have face-specific activity here in red, and maybe houses and scenes in blue, and bodies in green. But then you have this kind of general yellow area that's fairly specific and thought to be involved in more general object recognition. So the yellow areas would be not so domain-specific, and then the other domains would be more specialized. So how can we explain such a phenomenon that everybody sees, and it's hard to disagree with what we can all replicate. So we see category specialization in the brain. How can we explain it using domain-specific perceptual expertise? And that's sort of what I'm going to try to show you today, is how I think about that and where those ideas come from. And then you can feel free to challenge me and disagree with me. I'm used to it, and I enjoy it. So one piece of helpful knowledge is that the visual system, and we've known this for years, is sensitive to the task that we perform. Even when we look at the same stimulus, depending on what we do with it, we're going to activate the brain in different ways. So this is a very early example, which I found quite elegant when I started as a grad student. And so in this study, this was a PET study, but in this study, subjects would be looking at stimuli like this with faces, but there are also spatial landmarks, and they had to make one of two judgments. So sometimes they were asked to match the face, so they would look at this one and choose which one matched, and then in another condition, they were asked to pay attention to the location of these images and only make a judgment about which of the two matched in terms of the location of the squares, and the squares moved a little. And when these scientists compared these conditions, they saw different areas for the same stimulus, right? So I'm learning. So you have areas that were more active during the face task and areas that were more active during the location task. And this is one of many, many examples. Now, in behavioral studies, others have shown that when you learn to do a task on objects, it can have a lasting influence on how you perceive them. So this is another example out of many from Goldstone, where with these simple square stimuli, the task that subjects had to do was to categorize them. So these stimuli vary in their size, the size of the squares and the brightness of the squares. And subjects were simply taught to categorize them as A's or B's. Now they could learn that those are A's or those are B's, but in another condition, it might divide the space along this boundary and learn that those are A's or those are B's. And when this was done, what could be tested later is how well people could discriminate two of these squares. So you may ask people, you may show them this one and then this one and say, are they the same or different? And you can do this along this dimension here. And what Goldstone was able to show was that after having categorized those squares along this dimension, along this category boundary, so that brightness is the relevant dimension and size is not relevant to this categorization, subjects become better at making this discrimination between pairs of squares that vary along brightness and less good along size. So suggesting that something of the category learning really influenced the way they perceive these objects. Now, recently, Jonathan Folstein, Tom Palmieri, and I did a similar study, but an Fmri study to look at what was happening in the visual system when you do a similar task. So in this case, you have a space of cars, and they're created by morphing four parents. So you have a morph line between parents A and parent A, parent B, and then parent C and parent D. If you're far away, you may think those are all the same cars. They're not. They're very similar, but they're different. And then, so this car would be a mix of this one, and so on. And we taught people to categorize the space, so either along this line or along this line in different conditions. And then we then put people in the scanner and use a task that's very similar to what Goldstone had done behaviorally, but in the scanner we're taking advantage of a phenomenon called Fmri adaptation, where we can detect neural adaptation as a proxy for the discriminability of two stimuli in a given area of the brain. So we're asking people to look at a first car, and then there's a mass, and then there's a second car, and they actually simply decide whether they're in the same location or not. So the shape information is not relevant, but what we want to know is whether visual areas that are sensitive to shape are going to care about these differences, in particular whether the two cars are along a diagnostic versus a non-diagnostic, a relevant versus an irrelevant dimension for the categorization that they learn. So here what I'm showing is the area that we found where you see a difference between pairs. So, we compared all the different objects in these pairs. So the pairs that either vary along the diagnostic dimension versus the non-diagnostic dimension. And so what you're seeing here is that the identical pair, so this is showing the same car twice, is showing you less signal because there's the maximum adaptation. And for the irrelevant dimension, so when the cars vary along a dimension that's not relevant to the category learning, you get the same signal. But when the two cars vary along a dimension that was relevant for category learning, then you see less adaptation. So it's like this part of the brain and the ventral system has learned to be sensitive to a dimension that was relevant to a task that people are not performing at the time. They learned the category learning before. And by the way, if some of you are familiar with a similar study that was published by Jiang and colleagues and from the Reisenhuber lab, which found a very different result, I'm happy to explain why the results are different later on, so we can talk about that. But I just wanted to give you some examples here before I proceed to some of my studies on expertise that, we know that how we attend to objects, so the tasks that we do with objects online, or how we learn to categorize objects can change activity in the visual system. So that's well established. So why not long-term experience with different domains? So for things like musical notation or letters or faces or cars. So that's what I'll talk about. In fact, in my lab, we have and continue to study perceptual expertise in these different domains. So we study experts in musical notation, letters, Chinese characters, and so on. But I'll focus mostly this talk around face and face-like expertise. Now that I almost make this trivial, that this should work, I should also, take a step back and remind you that there is a view that the visual system is not so plastic in terms of what we learn about objects. And so one view, this is an example from Bldg and colleagues This is a study in the macaque where the monkeys were exposed to objects from 3 different categories. They were spikies and smoothies and cubies, and the monkeys learned some tasks with these different objects and learned one category but not the other, and they were tested at different times. These are 2 different monkeys, and the summary of the whole study is that none of the influences, none of the learning seemed to change much of the map. What seemed to happen here is that there was a stable kind of shape map in an animal. And even if you taught them more about one category or another, the shape map didn't change so much, leading these people to suggest that inferotemporal cortex contains a large-scale map of shape that's independent of meaning, familiarity, and behavioral tests. Now, these authors have done the same study or similar study in humans and have found slightly different results. So this is debated, but there is a view that a lot of what we see that's interesting in the visual system of humans has very little to do with experience and learning. And some of this, I came to this question from the study of face perception in the brain. So one very landmark study was done by Nancy Kenwisher and colleagues, published in 97, showing that there was an area now called the FFA, for fusiform face area. Here it is. It's in the ventral temporal lobe, and mostly on the right hemisphere, but you can find one on the left too, that responded more to faces than almost anything else that you could show to the subjects. And it was proposed at the time in that first paper that the FFA was some kind of special purpose machinery for face perception. And in fact, in a recent PNAS article, Kenwisher still defends that same view, that there really is the way she puts it is there's a special piece of real estate in the cortex that is dedicated to the processing of faces, and that this cannot be explained by experience. Okay, so that is quite a different view from where I started from, and so my area of research, like many others, can be described as a series of these pendulum swings, right, between our face is special, our face is not special, and this is maybe it fits my personality. It's fine by me. I do like to disagree with people and be challenged about my theories. So part of what I'm going to try to do is to introduce you a little bit to the history of this debate as it motivates the last studies that I want to talk about, which are studies of high-resolution imaging at 7 Tesla of the fusiform face area. So my view of what face perception is about has to do with perceptual expertise. So for the last 15 years or so, I've pursued the hypothesis that has been outlined by others before me and is shared by at least some people around me, that the sort of specialization that we see in the brain and in behavior for faces has something to do with perceptual expertise. The idea being that with faces we need to individuate them. So when I look at you, I may, even if I don't learn your names, I may recognize that I've seen you before, but if I do that, it's not sufficient to know that there were 2 eyes above a nose, above a mouth. I need to learn something about those individual features, either the shape of your individual features that are different between your faces, or their configuration, or likely both of these things. And this is very different from the information that I need to just say this is a face. And this is similar, in our view, to what you need to do in other domains. So to a non-expert, these are mushrooms, and of course you can see differences. You can see lots of colors and all of that. But if you were exposed the next day to a new kind of mushroom, and I said, well, was this on the plate that I shown you before? The expert would know that. The novice would be like, oh, I don't know. There were some red ones, but I can't quite remember. You don't know what the important features are. So there's been this debate between these two extremes. FFA as a special purpose machinery for faces, or the fusiform face area as a case of specialization due to expertise. Now, to give, some of you know this work well, but to give some of you some context, yes, please. The difference between these two? Yes, sure. Let me clarify. According to this view, this is likely, and it's a special purpose machinery for faces. There's a kind of an innate specialization in the cortex, and it only does face perception. In this view, this area is not by default specialized for face perception. It may be the best place to solve the problem of face perception, but if you solve a similar perceptual problem for something else, could be mushrooms, could be cars, could be birds, you're going to use the same part of the cortex. So it's a
mental question?
It can be framed both as a question of what the FFA can do. So without even looking at the development, you may look at an adult subject and say, is this area only domain specific? Is it a very specialized module only for one domain? But it can also be framed as a more developmental question in terms of the origins. Why do we have an FFA? So as an adult, if you have one, where does it come from? So you're right to question what is the question here, because there are many. When we say our face is special, people mean many different things here. So hopefully I will try to clarify what this talk is about. My talk tomorrow is yet about a slightly different question about holistic processing and how we recognize faces. So there are many different levels here.
Is there a real contradiction? One is more specialized, the other is less specialized, and maybe they're converging or gradual, whatever.
Yeah, it's been framed as a very a debate with extremes, and you're right. You could be you could meet somewhere in the middle. No question. I think you have to look at the evidence and ask yourself, what does the evidence, where along this continuum does the evidence?
But many motor skills, learning, walking, you have to learn, but you have something built in or something.
Right, and so the question is, what is built in? And in particular here, is there something built in this part of the brain that has to do with with the domain of faces? Is this an area that's prepared to do face recognition, or is it prepared to solve this problem of perceptual expertise that you could apply to other domains? Okay, so the first kind of swing of this pendulum that I tried to take was in my dissertation, where we said, okay, well, if faces are special, maybe we can try to train people in a different domain and see if we can get the same sort of perceptual expertise. So some students in the lab, in Michael Tarr's lab at the time, designed those infamous now objects, the greebles. He now works and makes computer games and makes things that are even more crazy than this. But what I had asked them was to make something that was similar to faces in the sense that they had a small number of parts in the same configuration, and we could have many different exemplars. So the greebles can be categorized into two categories. Here we have the plucks and the glips, and those are simply objects that have the parts going up or down. So that's a very easy discrimination to learn. But if I taught you the name of this one, so I say this is Pimo, and then I showed you a lot of greebles, say find Pimo, this is harder. And this is what we train people to do in the lab, or that's what I did at the time. We wanted to train people to become as fast to recognize an object at the individual level than they were at this this easy categorization of whether the parts were up or down. So this is an example of the training data for one subject, the reaction time for both the family judgment, which is very fast, very early in the training. So if you have to say, is this Pimo or is this a Baddock, let's say, so this would be a category. This is easy, but the individual levels, recognizing whether this is the specific object, takes a lot of time to become equally fast. So we train people to do this in the lab. And then we had scans, so this is very early imaging, done at 1.5 Tesla. It's a slice through the ventral temporal cortex before and after training with these subjects. And what we were comparing here was activity in the brain for upright versus inverted faces. Inverted faces are a good way to kind of control for a lot of the perceptual features, but people are not experts with inverted faces and do not show a lot of the same activations and special behaviors. So when you do this, either before or after training, there's no significant change there, you find this fusiform face area. But what was interesting is that when you do Griebel's upright versus inverted, in a novice, those are objects, such objects minus objects. You find really nothing that was consistent across subjects in this region. But after training, you did. So this is a measure of activity in the fusiform face area over 6 training sessions, and you see an increase of activity for Griebel. Interestingly, a decrease for faces, which at the time we hadn't noted, but we'll come back to that later. Now, I'm giving you some very specific information here, which is how large this region of interest was in the brain. And I wouldn't usually do that, except that some of my story today is about resolution. So I want to tell you where we started in this study, which was, this was about, let's say, the size of the region of interest that we were looking at, centered on the fusiform face area for each subject. And if you ask, well, how large is the fusiform face area, this is a survey we recently did of 37 Fmri studies. And there's a distribution of the size of the region, but on average it's about this size. So, we were a little bit bigger than a fusiform face area. Now, why should you worry about that? Well, at the time, one of the criticisms was, you're looking at an expertise effect in this large region. Maybe your effect is coming from non-selective areas that are not the real FFA, and so maybe it's just, you're not really in face selective territory. Now, after that work with the Griebels, we went to look at other domains. In fact, that's when I worked with Nancy Kenwisher and did a study on expertise with cars and with birds. So the idea was that if worked with both of these domains, you could say, well, birds have faces, although cars don't have faces. One is man-made, one is not. You can make a case that things are fairly general. One of the important things is that we don't ask people whether they're experts. That typically doesn't work, especially for cars. Most of the men we test claim to be car experts. And then, some are and some are not. And many of the women who actually end up being really good car experts say, no, I'm not very good. And then, so we just measure perceptual ability. And we've done this for years with this very simple task where we show one car, a mask, another car, and people have to say whether they're the same model, regardless of, they don't have to name the model, they just have to say same or different, regardless of changes in viewpoint and color and all sorts of things. And then we can do this with many different categories. I'll come back to planes later. But in this study, we had done this for cars and for birds, and got a measure of how good you were relatively for cars and for birds. And this is an example for one car expert and one bird expert of the activity in the same slice that you were looking at. And I don't have the localizer for the FFA, but I can guarantee you it falls right here. So this car expert shows activity in the FFA for cars minus objects, but not for birds minus objects. And here you see a bird expert that shows the same thing for birds minus objects, but not for. Okay, so, and this plot, which I won't go into the details because it's not very important, but along this axis, we have a relative measure of activation in the brain in the FFA for cars versus birds. So everybody who's up here responds more to birds, and those down here respond more to cars. And this is this behavioral measure that I was showing you here. So everybody who's on this end is better with birds. That's why all of these, they're the bird experts, and all those people are car experts. And you can see a nice correlation between the signal in the FFA to these categories and their ability outside of the scanner to recognize these objects. They're actually different objects. They're not so the birds or the cars that they demonstrate their expertise on are different ones from the ones we scanned them with. So in this study, to get back to the size of our regions, one of the things that we had done was to look at the three, they're big, but they're in fact very small. They're the three most face-selective voxel in each subject. So no smoothing of the maps, just find the parts of the map that respond most to faces compared to objects, and then look at how much variance was explained by expertise, and it was 36% of the variance that was in the small region that was explained by expertise. So So this is getting really into the fusiform face area, much smaller than the fusiform face area, trying to make a claim that we were really in phase-specific territories. Now I want to specify that in that work, we have found that not only the FFA was sensitive to expertise, but also other regions. So for example, so this is the FFA. This is a map. This is an average map for all of our subjects, all the bird experts and the car experts, and we're looking at the areas, like the interaction between group and categories. So those are the areas that respond more to your domain of expertise minus the other domain. So it's cars minus birds for our car expert and vice versa for a bird expert. So you can see the face area, but you can see something that we now call the occipital face area. Earlier in the ventral cortex, you can see something I'll show you again later in the medial fusiform gyrus, close to the PPA, periapical face area, but not exactly. So you see other spots, and there's some people here who have seen these effects of expertise elsewhere in the brain too. Okay, so we're now in 2000, and we found expertise effects for non-face objects in the FFA or near the FFA, or we're debating with other people how near the FFA enough they are for this to mean something. Others had replicated car expertise and bird expertise effects. So Yauda Shu had done some of this. Russell, Epstein, and I had several papers, well, at least one paper where we replicated these car effects in several experiments. So this is where we were at the time. Well, remember, the pendulum is swinging, right? So here's what happened. Someone decided to do studies with high-resolution Fmri imaging. So this is the size of an high-resolution voxel. These are the standard resolution voxels that I was working with at the time, and this is the size of the FFA. So this high-resolution voxel is about 1,000 times smaller than the size of the FFA. Now, is this going to change something or not? And the hope at the time was that you could, because clearly in any of these boxes you have a lot of neurons. There's a lot that's going on here. So people were debating whether when we see the same, two different things in the same place in the brain, whether Fmri could really tell you that these things were happening in the same systems, or whether you were just blurring two different things. Yes? This one is 1 by 1 by 1 millimeter. So Callan and Grospector did a study on this topic, and she showed people faces, animals, cars, sculptures, and scrambled images. And what she was after was something interesting, which was to say, if you look at these large standard resolution voxels that we were used to at the time, everybody agreed we saw something which was larger response in the FFA to faces than, let's say, cars or sculptures. Maybe animals were in between, but not as strong as faces. But the question was, what would you see if you went to smaller resolution? So would you see that so these here are the small resolution voxels. Would you see that they all respond in the exact same way as what you see in a large voxel? Or would you see that, well, some of them are really, truly phase selective, but others are not, so it's a mix of the two? Or would you see these two populations, but they would be really intermixed spatially in this region? Or maybe you'd see specialization for different categories. So that was the question, is what would you gain by increasing the spatial resolution of Fmri for this question? And so here are some results from Kalanick and also from Baker et al. In the same sort of experiments. I'm going to tell you what this graph shows you, because I'm going to show you a similar graph later in my study. So what is done here is you take half of your data and you sort voxels in 4 different categories. So you take a voxel and you say, which of those 4 categories I've shown people does it respond most to? So if you have a voxel that responds most to faces, it goes in this group, and then if you have a voxel that responds more to animal, it goes in this group, and so on. And then you take the other half of the data and you say, well, can I replicate this? Was this something real, or was that just noise or random luck? And you can see that the phase voxels in one half of the data really do replicate in the second half of the data. They respond more to faces than to anything else, and this is true. These 2 experiments are really identical. They're both with a small number of subjects, but the methods are really the same. So they're different in some respects, and there really is no explanation for this. So I just want to give you a general sense of what was known at the time. The animal voxels, at least in one experiment, responded a lot more to animals than cars and sculptures. In this case, it's not the case, but they respond a lot to faces. And then there was no significant, statistically significant evidence that a car voxel was really a car voxel, and so on. So at this point, the summary was that what you see when you take a high-resolution picture of the FFA is something like this. So you have some voxels that are highly face-selective. That's the true FFA. And it's kind of interspersed with other areas that are not really selective for faces or anything else. So this is also consistent with some work in the macaque, both Fmri and physiology, that shows that, so this is the macaque brain, this is the human brain, and you can see face-selective spots in the macaque brain, and if you then put needles in there and record from these spots, Tsao and colleagues have found that almost all of these cells are really highly selective for faces compared to everything else. Okay, so this matches well with the view from high-resolution fMRI. So to summarize, where we are now in our debate, and also I'm just summarizing some of the other ideas that were floating around at the time. This suggested that, well, if you found selectivity for objects, so let's say in a study with expertise, in the FFA, it probably was due to spatial blurring, because the studies we had done with expertise were with low resolution. That people were also saying that responses to objects in the FFA were not really related to perceptual performance. So the response to faces was really strongly related to how you perceive faces, and there were some studies showing this, and they were saying, well, you probably see something epiphenomenal with objects. And then I'll come back to this later, but people were also saying these expertise effects in the FFA could be due to attentional modulation, because a car expert is going to be interested in cars, and so that could increase activity in the whole visual cortex. So this takes me to a Zen moment in my life where I said, this could be no fun, to debate this forever in my scanner.
In your life so far? In
my life so far. Yeah, I'll probably have more Zen moments as we proceed in this trip. And I actually decided maybe I shouldn't try to do another fMRI experiment here. Maybe I should work with other people and do a behavioral experiment to ask a question that's very similar. This is an interlude, and then we'll come back to imaging. To ask what I thought at the time was the real question. If faces are special in the brain, then face perception should be somewhat protected from interference from other kinds of perception. And so we wanted to ask whether we could find evidence of competition between faces and other objects of expertise. So this is a fairly simple study. I'll show you the task, and then I'll show you the evidence. So on every trial here, people were shown two faces, and then they get a stream of objects, one at a time, a face, a car, a face, a car, a face, a car, and their task is at the end of the stream, which was about 30 objects, they have to decide which of those two faces was present in the stream. The cars are completely irrelevant, okay? Now, we're interested in whether they're going to interfere. And our dependent measure was the speed at which we could alternate these objects for a certain performance level. Okay, so we start at one speed, and then we staircase it to find a threshold. Now, in a control condition, we have people doing the same task, and we replace the cars by watches. Our subjects were varying along car expertise, so that we had some subjects who were really novices with cars all the way to people who were very good with cars. So in this case, our prediction is that there might be interference, but only in a car expert, in this task, but not this task. And this is, in fact, what we found. So what I'm showing you is the threshold here, so how fast people can do this task for the task where you search for a face amongst cars and a face amongst watches. For a face amongst watches, you see no evidence of interference. For a face amongst cars, you see that the novices can actually do it faster than the experts. Now, these two different tasks are different because if you notice, the watches are more similar in their shape to the faces. So overall, even in a novice, so in the white bars, people do the car task more easily. But there's a difference, according to expertise, for the faces amongst cars. And in fact, this is the difference between those two, those two conditions. So controlling for just how good they are for faces from the car task. And what you see is this index of interference varies as a function of car expertise. This is the same measure of car expertise that I've shown you before. So in a different task, how good you are at recognizing cars. And the better you are at recognizing cars, the more interference you got. Now, you could say, well, this just comes from cars grabbing attention, right? So we did this control experiment where instead of searching for cars, you're now for faces, you're searching for watches. So now you get your two watches and you see the stream, and the cars are still completely irrelevant. But if they grab your attention, if this interference just comes for them grabbing your attention, they should interfere here in a car expert. And here's a control condition. And in this case, what we see is the reverse effect. So what we're finding is that we actually see, as a function of car expertise, less interference from cars on watches. Okay, so the car experts are better at the watch task now when they are present. So what this means, to put these two things together, is that as a novice, your car processing is close to your watch processing. It's an object. A car is an object, so they're going to interfere more. As you increase your car expertise, the cars become more like faces, and you find more interference now for cars on faces. So we've used similar competition paradigms in other studies. Some of them, and others have too. So some of this is my work, some of this is not. Some of it is with ERP, some of this is in patients, some of this is in this task. We've done it in a standard visual search task. And to some extent, this doesn't tell you where it happens in the brain. This may have nothing to do with the FFA, it's behavioral. Clearly when you get ERPs, you have a sense of a bit where and when, but it's not clearly happening in the FFA. But it tells you something about how functionally face processing and car expertise are not functionally independent. Okay. So, but remember, there were two roads in my Zen moment. So I came back after a few years and decided, okay, now we got a bigger scanner. It's a 7 Tesla, and maybe we can try to do the high-resolution imaging of the FFA to see what do we see for these expertise effects, and because that hadn't been done. So at 7 Tesla, the previous work, like the car and bird work that I showed you, was 3 Tesla. The Griebel work was 1.5. So, more Tesla, better signal-to-noise ratio, and improved resolution with fairly good coverage. Many technical challenges, actually, not just some, but I won't talk about them today. And this work is the dissertation work of Rankin McGugan, who's wonderful, works really hard. So in this study, we're going to bring in a population of subjects, 25 subjects in fact, and measure their expertise for cars and also for other objects, in this case planes. But what's important is to see, this is just the distribution for our 25 subjects. This is the mean of their performance in the car task. There's quite a bit of the distribution. And that's what we need in this study because we're interested in very individual differences. These are some of the uninteresting details. But this is the resolution that we achieved in this particular study, 1.25 millimeters isometric. And we used similarly very similar to what Calinet had used with faces, animals, cars, although they're different cars than she used, because when you test car experts, it's very important to use the cars that are going to tap into the expertise of your subject. We have planes. So this is a run where we show I can do this. Where we show people, faces, animals, car, planes, and sculptures. And the task is to detect repetitions of the same face or the same object. For each subject, we flatten the cortex and we find the peak of activity for faces. And then we define regions of interest that grow around that. So this would be one subject of activation, facial activity here in the FFA. And then we're going to do this voxel sorting, just like Callan had done. So the blue voxels here are the voxels that are more selective for faces or highest response to faces and so on. But remember, this is defined from a standard resolution localizer. Everything at this in this area, this large area, is face selective at standard resolution. It responds more to faces than objects. Now, this varies a lot between subjects, so this would be a car novice, just one, here a car expert, and you can see a lot of different things happening within a region that's face selective. And one question is, well, but remember, Callan and others had found that only the face voxels were really replicating, so what are we seeing? So this is, for two subjects, the data for the odd runs and the even runs. So this is half of the data, and you can see some of it replicates and some of it doesn't, right? So many of the phase voxels are still there, but some of them are switching sides, and there's a lot going on. So it's important to question whether, when you say this is a phase voxel, this is a car voxel, whether it really is.
Experts or novices?
Let's see. This was a car novice. This was a car expert. I'm not.
So these are experts.
These are both experts. Yeah. So let me show you the same graph, the way that Callan had analyzed the data. So first of all, this is the signal in the whole region showing, what do you see if you were looking at a standard resolution signal, and you see a lot of activity for faces, some for animals, some for cars, and some for planes. So this is very much, she had 6 subjects, Baker had 5, I think. This is 25, and we're still seeing the same thing. And if we sort these voxels, we find about 46% of them are phase voxels, and they highly replicate. Yeah, we want to keep hydrating me. Thank you. I'm going to drink both at the same time. Thank you for your patience. So the phase voxels are replicating. They really are phase voxels. The animal voxels are doing, again, this thing where they respond a lot to faces and a lot to animals more than cars and planes. And there really isn't anything that's happening that's very exciting for cars or planes voxels, right? So, hey, we spent, a lot of time and money replicating what they had seen already, so that's clearly not the end of the story. Here's a median split between the half of our sample, the car novices versus the car experts, just showing you the distribution of voxels that are selective to different categories. And one thing you can see is that there's an increase in the car selective voxels. It goes from 6% to 12%, and this is actually a significant increase. So that's one sign that it's actually important to look at these data with expertise. And in fact, here's a different way of looking at the same bar graph, which is to look at an index of selectivity. So here we have our signal for faces, animals, cars, and planes, but what we do, this is something that in the literature has been called D-prime. I like to note that, in fact, according to signal detection theory experts, it should be called DR, because it's not a D-prime, it's more like a Cohen's D. But anyway, what you do is you take the mean, the activity for the preferred categories, let's say it's a phase voxel, so the activity for phase voxels minus all of the other categories over an estimate of the variance. And what you can see is, again, that for faces in animals, you get replication, you get you get selectivities. Those phase voxels really are phase selective, and the same thing for animals. For cars and planes, you get nothing. But remember, this is not looking at expertise. If you take this signal and you spread it, if you take this bar graph here and you spread it as a function of behavioral car expertise, this is what you get. You get a significant increase in selectivity for cars as a function of expertise. This is another way to look at the same thing. So again, this is a median split, car experts, car novices. This is looking at all those voxels that we find and asking, well, what's their D prime? And if you look at car novices, the distribution really is centered on 0, and you can see the yellow distribution is kind of to the left here. But the car experts are skewed. In fact, you can find very selective car voxels and car experts. The distribution really shifts in selectivity for car experts. Now, this is what I had shown you just a second ago, this increase in selectivity for cars. If you look at the other voxels, the phase voxels, animal voxels, and plane voxels, what you see is something different. So, for example, as a function of car expertise, plane signal doesn't change. Why should it? As a function of car expertise, the signal for animals actually goes down. And in this case, it's not significant, but in the new studies that we have a second study that replicates this reaches significance. The signal for phase selectivity also goes down in the phase voxels. So there seems to be a trade-off.
What goes down is that both signal change or the number of voxels?
No, this is the both signal change. This is an index of selectivity for each voxel to phases compared to all the other categories. So it really is trading off between, and that's why I pointed out in the Griebel study there was a decrease for faces, and we're seeing this here again. So this is an example just to show you that this is kind of uniform in the face area. So these are our phase voxels, animal voxels, car voxels, and plane voxels, and this is the percent signal change, the response to cars as a function of car expertise. And in all of those voxels, except animal voxels, we find the same response, which is an increase. Okay. So now, here's something interesting. Is this just because in our task, people are looking at these cars and these spaces and objects. They're paying attention to their shape. So maybe this is just attention to cars and car experts. And if that was the case, when that's brought up, one of the interpretation is that this would be going on. So let's say the phase area really only has phase selective voxels and then something else that's not selective. Okay, so the red parts would be phase selective and the blue parts are not. If you don't pay attention to cars, so let's say you're a car novice, you'd get your phase selectivity and then the other voxels would respond to everything else the same. But if you pay attention to cars, it would be the blue stuff that goes up, for cars, and that's what we would capture, right, in those signals. But the point is that this should not be confined to the phase selective regions. It should happen everywhere. I mean, the theory here is that the blue part that's here is the same as the blue part that's there. It's that this is not anymore related to perceptual expertise, and this should be uniform. So in order to look at this, we did an analysis of the spatial distribution of our signals. So this is a kind of a funky graph because some of this is spatial information and some is not, but it's actually fairly simple. These are the different regions centered on phase selectivity. So this is a very, very small region of interest centered on the peak of the FFA. It's 25 millimeters square, and then you get a larger one, and then rings around that to kind of see where the effects come from. And what is plotted, those are your 4 categories of voxels that we've been sorting before. So the phase voxels, the animal voxels, the plane voxels, and the car voxels. And the color scale here is the strength of the correlation of activity to cars and car expertise. So those graphs I've been showing before, when there's an expertise effect, there's more signal for cars as a function of car expertise. And what you can see is that this effect is happening in the central area in different kinds of voxels, but up to about 200 millimeter squares, and after that it drops. It's not there. It's not significant. And we made sure that we were getting, this is just a check, that we were getting good signal at 7. You have to worry about 7 Tesla imaging. There's a lot of artifacts and inhomogeneities. And so this is a plot of the signal in those different regions when we look at the mean signal for scrambled images versus fixation. And we get as good of a signal in all of these regions of interest. So this is to show that even though there's signal there, the expertise effect is centered on the SFA. Okay. So I'm almost done here. And what this suggests is that in a novice subject, what you seem to get is kind of this picture. In a novice subject, we find phase selectivity in the SFA. We don't really find evidence of car voxels or anything like that. But in an expert, in a car voxel, you might really find car selectivity, an increase in car. And actually, you might find a reduction in phase selectivity. So this suggests that selectivity for SFA, for objects in SFA, is not necessarily due to spatial blurring. That responses to objects in SFA are related to perceptual performance. That's how we define the effect here, as a correlation with perceptual performance outside the scanner, and that expertise effects in the FFA are not due to attentional modulation of non-phase selective regions. I want to skip a few slides here, mostly to save my voice. Some of this are details. But I mostly focus here on the FFA. We can look, and we have looked in other regions of the brain here. So this is just one subject localizer, and we have the FFA and the occipital face area and the medial fusiform gyrus that responds more to objects and faces. Just to situate you, car expertise effects were found in this study in the right OSA, but not on the left. So this region, which exists, it's phase selective on the left, showed absolutely no expertise effect. We found the kind of expertise effects I've shown you both on the right and the left FFA, but they were also present in this medial fusiform region. We also, and I'm not showing you this, we also found plane expertise effects. So the really same thing, but for plane. And they're only on the right. And this is a really interesting question, why it is, and will motivate a series of experiments for us. Because there are important, I'll tell you the most important difference between our car experts and plane experts in this study is that our car experts knew they were car experts. They self-identified as car experts. Our plane experts, only 2 of them in our sample knew that they were plane experts, that they would, all of the other ones said, oh, yeah, no, I predict I won't do very well on planes. But we had a nice distribution, and we can still find these effects. But you don't need to know that you are really good with a domain. As long as you perform really well, you can find these effects in the brain. So these are my summary slides. So when you look in the brain, and you look for category selectivity, you see spots. And we try to interpret what these spots mean, right? So let's say these are all spots. When you show people faces minus objects, you find spots of phase selectivity. And then, you look for something else, I don't know, scenes or body parts, and you find other spots of selectivity for other domains, and they're separated. And when we did our expertise study with cars, in this case, we found in some areas, say the FFA, lots of overlap between the two. Some areas may overlap a little, and some areas don't overlap. So you will find overlap between faces and objects of expertise, and we believe that this is related to a common process between the two, which I don't have time to go into today, but we think it's how people are perceiving these objects in a holistic manner, and I'll talk more about that tomorrow if I have a voice, but I think we're back on track. Some areas are responsive to faces, but not car plane expertise. The left OFA, we don't find an expertise effect there. And some areas don't respond to faces, like the medial fusiform gyrus, but they respond to car plane expertise. So what does this all mean? Well, one question is, if you were going to say, look, there are areas that are phase selective and they don't show an expertise effect, you have to remember there might be another domain, not cars or planes, who knows what, mushroom expertise, that when you do the study might end up there, right? It's hard to, since we found differences between planes and cars, there's no question that another domain, if you could test all the domains, might end up there. And moreover, I think it's important to remember that within the FFA, the area that really has been proposed in this field as a phase-specific module for recognition of phases, a really specialized part of real estate in the brain, we were not able, even at high resolution, to find phase-selective voxels that did not show a car expertise effect. And the selectivity was centered on the peak of the expertise effect was centered on the peak of phase selectivity. This is what I just said. So not even the FFA appears to be solely dedicated to a single category. There are different domains of expertise that can produce different patterns of selectivity in the visual system. And instead of debating whether faces are special or not, I would like other people in the field to help us understand how experience can cause these changes, because I think it's critical to understand the functional organization of the brain. If we are so interested and fascinated, as the field seems to be, into category specialization, I think this is a good, this gives you traction to try to understand where it comes from. And I'm done. And this is Rankin email, if you, yeah, any questions? Yes?
Is it possible that people who are experts in cars learn how to look at cars as spaces? Meaning the headlights are high?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. It certainly was suggested with the greebles, because people say, well, greebles look like faces. You know, I'll say this. First of all, greebles look like faces to any novice, and yet it takes several sessions of training to get the effect. So even though you can say it looks like a face, that doesn't seem to give you the effect. Now, as you say, you might learn to look at them as faces. In our studies, we typically, in car experts, we typically have always tested them with profiles of cars, where the similarity to faces is really not as present. So there's a point where you have to define what a face is. I think the most important point is that there's a change. There's a change with expertise, and it's happening for many different domains. We found it with greebles, with cars, with birds. We found it with other kinds of novel objects. So that's what I would say. If you look at the big picture, I think that's not a parsimonious explanation.
You ask people, I learned in the army to discriminate between clans.
Right.
There are techniques to do it.
Do you see them as faces?
No. Did you ask them the technique?
No. As I said, the plane experts here, for example, had they did not consider themselves as plane experts. Why they're really good with planes is interesting. The car experts tend to be, they're not mechanics here. There are people who are, they go to car shows. They're in our undergrad population, and they just, look at a lot of magazines. They're into cars. They're the kind of people who, when they're driving, they can spot a car really fast and know what it is. And so, but if we test these people behaviorally, we've shown this with other cars that look equally like faces but are from a different domain, for example, antique cars, we do not see the same effect of expertise. So it's very specialized to the similarity phase that they've experienced. Yes?
But from what you say, I think the main question now is what makes that a thing special? I mean, what is it in every day that allows them to largely be special for this is something made of expertise? What is it there?
Well, I think that what makes faces special is expertise.
And what makes that a thing special? Not what makes faces
or obsession with that part of the brain, I think, is what makes FFA special. I think if you put people in a scanner and you show them different domains of expertise, I mean, if we had started with cars and car experts, we would have seen that spot, and we wouldn't have started calling it the face area, and we might have started in a different place. When we put people in a scanner who can read musical notation, we see spots in the brain that are more active for musical notation, in experts, and I mean, you can see these things for letters. So you can see specialization in the cortex for a lot of things. Most of us are quite good at face recognition. There's variability, right? And it seems to correlate with activity in the FFA too. And it's been shown performance on the Cambridge face memory task predicts selectivity for faces and the fusiform face area. So what makes the FFA special seems to be how good we are at identifying faces. Now, behaviorally, I think this has...
What is it there? Is it different? Is it the pattern of its input? Is it the pattern of its, I don't know, natural interaction?
Right. I mean, my best guess comes from our efforts to relate the changes that we see when we train experts, which I haven't, apart from the Griebel study, I haven't shown you a lot of these studies, but we do several studies where instead of bringing experts, we train them. And we can track changes in what we call holistic processing. So that's how difficult it becomes for someone to pay attention to a part of an object and ignore other parts, which is very difficult with faces. And with novel objects, it's very easy for novices to do that. It becomes harder as you become an expert. And this is the best predictor we seem to find of the changes that are occurring during training and the FFA. So I think, now, if you ask, well, what is holistic processing, there's a whole field of research that I'm not even going to get to tomorrow.
What is it in FFA that makes it better for holistic
Right.
processing?
It could be many different things, and it could be as simple as the size of the features there are the right ones to perform identification tasks when objects are homogeneous in this way. So both faces or cards have similar parts in a similar configuration, and there might be an optimal size of the features that is really good when you're trying to do this task, and this is where it gets. It could be that simple. I think.
Yeah, one question. I mean, we've had a lecture by Galia Abidan a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, and she showed us that actually FFA, which is supposed to be involved with expertise, is activated in congenitally prosopagnostic
Right.
subjects. So certainly they're not experts in face recognition. So how do you reconcile this?
That is a big puzzle. Is that particular finding that you can find in several studies, and I've shown you some, but this has been replicated many times, a really nice, these correlations between behavioral performance and activity of the SFA in several domains is very strong. I mean, I think last time I did the, small meta-analysis, the average correlation was like 0.85 or something. It's a lot of variance of behavioral tasks that you explain from the signal in the SFA for non-face objects. And as I said, it's been done with faces too, so you can relate the performance, the amount of activity there for faces predicts how well you can recognize faces. And then this finding that...
This is among normal people? Or
this is among normal people. And then this finding that in some people who can't recognize faces as well, you don't find this. And I think there's a lot of work to be done in this. I mean, some people have suggested that even though you find facial activity there, the responses are not normal. If you get to more... tasks that tap into more subtle aspects of face processing. There could be several components there.
There's certainly touching here, but
oh, did I mention there's a debate here? Absolutely. Yes.
Okay. So one analysis that's more and more done recent years is kind of taking several voxels filed by Hines, taking several voxels and then doing the predictive measurements on the single trial. Have you tried?
Yes, we've done multiple. We've done so many analyses, and I'm not showing you on this data set, and we're still running more. We've done MVPA on this. We can easily, and this is a big sample, 25 subjects, we can easily decode, whether people are looking at faces, cars, or planes, or animals in any of our regions of interest, with this sample. I mean, it could be partly because we have car and plane experts in our sample that we're decoding cars and planes so well. What's interesting is that the spatial distribution of this effect, I mean, the MVPA does relate to car expertise, so the more car, we get better decoding with car expertise, but it's not as spatially localized to the FFA. It seems to be happening in a more distributed region. And that's not so surprising because you have several regions here that are showing changes with expertise. Not all, but several. So it doesn't add much to the story that I told you.
When you compare the predictive system area, so the prediction from like what you did with the with the different expertise.
Right.
Do you get the same result?
Yeah. Even if you can just take the face voxels in the middle of the FFA, and you can find better decoding of all these categories, especially cars and car experts and car novices. So it leads to the same general conclusion. Yeah. Was there another hand?
Yeah, go ahead.
Do you see a correlation between the performance in the training task and general sorting phases?
In the training task, and so you're asking, as we train an expert, do people become worse at face recognition?
In the Greebles.
Or Greebles? We did not have that in the Greebles study. We have, so Martin Berman and I and some other people I've published, one study was a prosopagnosis patient, so someone who started off with very little face selectivity in the areas that surrounded where the lesion was. And as we trained the person with Greebles, his performance with Greebles was not that great, but it improved. His performance with faces shut down, and activity in the brain for faces, there was just a little bit at pre-training, went down after that. So we stopped the training. We're like, gosh, we're making this person worse. That's not good. But all the competition work that I've shown you are not competition studies of that kind. So they're really online competition. And in those studies, we don't really find evidence that someone who's a car expert, when you're not, testing them in a task where they have to do both at the same time, they don't seem to be worse with faces. So it's not clear to me that the reorganization we're seeing here, with less selectivity for faces, is sufficient to show a deep decrement in face performance. But in this experiment that I've shown you, we did not run a detailed measure of face expertise. In the new experiments we're running now, we are doing that too. So I may have more evidence of that later.
What happens if you present some masked representation of, the big part of the face or so on? Do you get the same kind of response, or is it an expertise involves recognizing a face just for a glimpse of half the face?
Well, I haven't done a lot of that. Behaviorally, we do a lot of studies where we look at different parts of the face. I haven't. There are no studies of expertise that I know of where that is being done. There are studies where people showed, and you've done some in ERPs, with eyes and parts of it. So I don't have a good answer for you in the context of this test. I don't think we know.
Okay, that's a good test for expertise.
Yeah, I think it's clear. We know enough to, I think I could say, without people jumping up and down, that as you become an expert, so maybe in face expertise, as in object expertise, there's evidence that your processing of features and processing of the configuration are both getting better. So I would suspect that if you test experts with parts, they're also going to show you effects of expertise. They might not be as strong. Yeah.
I would like to ask a question also. Expertise is defined as the ability to quickly and effortlessly identify a particular exemplar from a homogeneous category. Right?
That's how I would define face-like expertise. I think there are other kinds of expertise that are not like that, like reading or musical notation.
Right.
Right.
But perceptual of the sense that is shown here. However, in your last series of studies where you looked at very individual boxes and found such overlap, the task not require individual identification.
That's right.
It was a categorical, basic category distinction, which is based on global perception, both of faces and, the way we define categories, different for experts and non-experts as well, is on the global shape first. And in order to get into the exemplar identification, we need the diagnostic features, which might be and probably are different in different categories. So for faces, I could think about the features and the configuration as being the diagnostic information which distinguish between my face and yours. For cars, there the difference between the expert and the non-expert is that the expert knows where to look. He knows what the distinctive features is. I know that the difference between a Mazda Lantis 2002 and Mazda Lantis 2003 is in the particular shape of the fog light. I have no idea, but that's supposed. All right?
I don't either.
That's a distinctive feature that is in the realm of knowledge of the expert, but not the novice. This type of information is not needed to make a distinction between faces and cars. So in all the experiments in which you make a basic level categorization, perhaps there is no reason to expect that there will be no overlap between...
Right. So let me clarify. First of all, even though the analyses that I've shown you have to do with whether we can tell it's a face or a car, but at the level of the data, in the scanner, people are doing an identity level judgment. So they're seeing a series of cars, and they have to say when they see the same car twice in a row. It's fairly easy distinction in the scanner because we actually are not looking in the scanner for a task where the novices and the experts differ that much. Because the image is the same one when it's the same car, so you just have to say, hey, here's the same car. They differ in size, but it's easy. We, however, based our analyses on the behavioral task in the lab, where the judgment is a lot harder, because you have to say that this car and this car, which are, two Honda Civics, but different viewpoints, different years, different colors, are the same model. So that's a very difficult individuation task, and that's why we get such a range of performance there. So all of our results for expertise here are driven by this individual difference in their ability to individuate cars that way. And I really honestly do not think that our car experts are doing this on salient, localized features. And the reason is that when we test them in those measures of holistic processing, we are seeing the same thing as with faces, which is that if we say, look at this odd image that's made of the bottom and the top of two different cars, and just make a judgment whether the bottoms match and ignore the top, the novices do that well. They can ignore any part of the car without a problem. The experts are unable to do that. They show, just like we show for faces, a tendency to look at the whole object. Even when we tell them, in this task, you should not do this, it's going to hurt you. So there seems to be a similarity for the same purpose. The purpose is individuation, a similarity of this perceptual strategy, which is holistic processing.
Any other questions? All right, so let's...
Thank you so much.